Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on Forgotten Weapons. I'm Ian McCollum, and as usual, we have a bunch of questions from the awesome folks who are on Patreon supporting Forgotten Weapons. So, got a couple pages of them here. Let's dig into these. First off, we're going to circle back to the question that Peter asked last month about how I would sabotage a country's small arms procurement, with a follow-up that I saw that I thought was almost as interesting, which was, okay, let's say I have effectively sabotaged Elbonia's national small arms procurement system. They have ended up with, just to recap, for a sidearm, they have a Schnellfeuer pistol in .30 Mauser. For a submachine gun, they have a Swiss MP41/44 in .30 Luger. For a rifle, they have a Swedish Gewehr 40, which is basically a Mauser carbine in this monstrous 8x63mm cartridge. And then for a heavy machine gun, or for a machine gun, they have a Czech ZB53, also in that very heavy cartridge. So let's say I am now being brought on by the Elbonian Defense Ministry to try and fix this. They have acquired all of these guns, and then they realize, ah, crap, this is terrible. What can we do about this? So the question is, what's the best you could make of that batch of small arms without being able to have the money to just scrap them all and buy new stuff? So I have a few thoughts on this matter. First off, I think you could go a long ways to fixing the handgun problem by disabling the selector switches on all the Schnellfeuers. Turn them into just semi-auto pistols. Because a semi-auto pistol with a shoulder stock is not nearly as bad as a machine pistol without a shoulder stock. So make sure guys have the shoulder stocks, make them semi-auto only. I think that would help on that side. It might be possible to take the submachine guns and rechamber them for .30 Mauser. I think that would be simpler than trying to redo the pistols in .30 Luger. That may or may not be all that effective. The logistical trickery of having to deal with .30 Mauser and .30 Luger is something that you might be able to overcome. Especially, it would depend on how the country had issued out those pistols and submachine guns. You might want to do something like issuing more of the submachine guns, or somehow segregating them so that large groups of people only need one of those two types of ammunition, which will help prevent them from getting mixed up. The biggest thing I think I would do would be to take that 8x63 cartridge and standardize on a much lighter loading of it than was originally developed by the Swedes. It was intended to be a heavy machine gun cartridge for effective anti-aircraft use. And then chambered, then the rifles were chambered in that just so that the machine gun crews could use the same ammo that they already had for their machine guns. Well, the heavy machine gun round is perhaps more powerful than it really needs to be. If you took that cartridge and loaded it down, reduce the bullet weight, reduce the velocity to something that's a little more handleable, I think you could get a decent compromise between a reasonably powerful machine gun cartridge, but also something that the troops can fire from the shoulder in a carbine without destroying their shoulders and getting terminal flinching. I don't know how much you could really do with the machine guns themselves. I picked the ZB53 because it's a gun that can really only be used from an emplaced mount, and it's an incredibly ludicrously heavy gun. You could do something with new barrels for them that are much lighter in profile. The gun didn't have quick detach barrels. I don't know if it's within the scope of the question to try and come up with a quick detach barrel, but in theory, if you could come up with some sort of, like the equivalent of a 1919 A6 conversion kit for a ZB53 with a lighter barrel, a bipod, and some sort of shoulder stock and usable trigger mechanism. The ZB53 has basically spade grips so that you can't fire it from the shoulder. You have to have the thing sitting on a mount. If you could, you might be able to engineer a solution to turn it into like the ZB53 A6. That would probably be helpful. The other thing that Elbonia might look at is developing some of its tactics around use of of putting those guns on mobile small vehicles. Like if you had Jeeps, and say you put dual mounts for ZB53s on a bunch of Jeeps. You have something that's light, highly mobile, highly portable, and you can use those sort of as mobile strong points, mobile machine gun positions to be supported by mechanized infantry. I think there are some ways that you could use small unit tactics to compensate for having what would generally be considered poor small arms in the first place. So that I thought was a pretty interesting question, especially as a two-parter. Like, first off, how do you sabotage the small arms of a national military? And secondly, what can you do to make the best of a bad situation if you've already got it? All right, our next question is from Wahoo, who says, what is the best way to learn about pricing on collectible firearms? Prices can be opaque and vary a lot between auctions, retailers, private sellers, etc. Does this just come with experience and watching all of these markets, or is there a faster / better way to get up to speed? Best advice on learning pricing and actually buying collectibles. Ultimately, there is no substitute for just experience, for seeing a lot of sales and starting to recognize what elements are actually rare, or are, more importantly, what elements are actually desirable that people are willing to pay more for. How often do guns come up for sale? And this applies to collectibles of any sort, I would assume. The best advice I could give someone would be to watch Gunbroker. They have a feature where you can search finished auctions up to 90 days old. And so that gives you a pretty decent backlog of completed sales for anything that's reasonably common. If you go looking for RSC rifles, you probably won't find any in the completed auctions on Gunbroker because they don't come up very often. But if you're looking for something more common, Swedish Mausers, Enfields, more standardized stuff, you can go there, look at the completed auctions, and then what I recommend doing is sort the listing by highest number of bids, because it's an easy mistake to look at what people are asking on Gunbroker and assume that that's what the gun is worth. You don't want to do that. You want to look at what people are actually paying. So look for only pay attention to auctions that have actually sold, that have one or more legitimate bids. And some of the best ones to find are guns that started for a penny or a relatively low price, and then bid up through a whole lot of bids to whatever point they finally sold at. There are other ways to look. That's certainly not the only source, and it's not the only one that you want to rely on, because Gunbroker is not necessarily indicative of the whole market. But it is probably the single place that has the most volume of guns that have actually sold, where you can actually see the sales prices. Obviously, looking at gun shows is another good source, but once again, you have to be able to balance what's a selling price versus what's an asking price. You can look at auction companies. Rock Island in particular has a very high volume, and if you do something like do a search for whatever gun you're looking for, and then use Google's tool to limit the site to rockislandauction.com or morpheauctions.com or any large-ish auctions, you can then get a nice listing of only the style of gun you're looking for. Now, one of the problems of doing this with relatively common stuff at Rock Island is that those guns will show up in regional auctions as part of lots, and then you're looking at, for $2,000, they sold the gun I'm interested in and these 3 other random things. And so at that point, that information doesn't really do you any good unless you know what the other random things are worth on their own. However, if you're looking for something that is a lot rarer or a lot more valuable, especially if they're machine guns, Rock Island, and especially Morphees. Definitely keep an eye on Morphees for machine gun prices. If it's, for example, the RSC rifles that I brought up before, Rock Island will probably have a couple of those that they've sold, and a Google search like that will go back many years. So one of the tricks there is you then have to recognize, like, okay, what time frame did this sale happen in? Was this a sale in 2005 or 2010 where the price is no longer relevant to today's market? Or was this a sale that happened 6 months ago and it is still relevant? I think those are some. Once you get started there, then you can move on to finding that'll give you a good starting point from which to judge other sources. Next up is Tanner. Says, why are German small arms so highly regarded by collectors? Is this just a hangover from World War II GIs? It sort of is, yeah. So part of it is World War II stuff is kind of at the height of its popularity right now because we're at that point where World War II is an event that people weren't directly involved in, but can remember and still have some family ties to. So there's a big nostalgia element to it, where if you look at something like the Civil War, nobody remembers talking to anybody who actually remembers the Civil War. It's too old. World War I is approaching too old, and although I think there's been a resurgence in interest in World War I with its centenary, we'll see how popularity of World War I stuff does over the next couple of decades. But World War II is hot stuff in sort of that parabolic time frame of collectibles. Like Vietnam will be coming up fairly soon if it's not already. Anyway, there's that element to it. The time frame is right. And then there's an element of German small arms were generally pretty effective. And if they weren't effective, they were at least interesting looking. They have some of they're one of only a couple of countries that developed self-loading rifles for general infantry use. It's basically US, Russia, and Germany. And I think there's an important element of the Germans are very relatable to Americans in that, especially during World War II, there was a huge population of very recent German immigrants in the US. Americans are able to look at Germans and go, basically, that's the same culture that we have, they just speak a different language. And that makes their technology kind of more familiar. By the same token, Americans tended to look at Japanese small arms and go, well, those people are alien and foreign and different from us. We don't have a lot of cultural commonality with Japan in the 1940s, and we don't like them. You then get a nice racist element to it, and then their small arms are kind of automatically treated as inferior as a result. Where Americans tended to look at them and go like, that's us, but speaking a different language. And then you have this element of the grass is always greener on the other side. Whatever the other guy has must be better than yours, unless there's some reason it's not. And the Germans, the Wehrmacht had a great aesthetic to it. Those guys looked sharp and snappy, and they were everything that the US was prepared to see as being at the forefront of technology and culture and society. And I think a lot of those values, a lot of those impressions have pretty well gotten stuck in our cultural memory. And yeah, that leads to people being very interested in German small arms. And that's beyond the whole element of the Nazi bad guy. You always want to, trophies from the bad guy are valuable. And the bigger and badder the bad guy looks, the more valuable it is to have a trophy from having beaten them. So a lot of elements go into it that all kind of synergize and give you, German small arms must be the most desirable to collect. Rhodey says, if you could pick any one firearm, if you could have your pick of any one firearm in a caliber other than what it was actually made in, what would you pick? For example, a 5.56 Shosha or a 9mm Thompson gun. I would not want either of those things. My choice for this is actually pretty easy. I would want an EM2, particularly maybe an EM2 Commando in 6.5 Creedmoor. And my rationale for that is 6.5 Creedmoor is about the right level of power, pretty similar to the original 280 British, or one of the original 280 Britishes that were variously developed through the course of the EM2. And it's a cartridge that physically would fit in the magazine. So you could do an EM2 in 6.5 Creedmoor and it would fit because 6.5 Creedmoor is designed around a 7.62 NATO mag. The second batch of EM2s were designed around 7.62 NATO. They'll fit in the magazine. And the cartridge is available. So what I would love to have is an EM2 in its original configuration. But as a practical matter, if you get that, you're then immediately tragically hampered by the fact that how are you going to get 280 British ammo? Well, if you have it in 6.5 Creedmoor, which is like 280 British modernized, sort of, not there's no direct connection between the two, but you get the idea, you would have a gun that you could actually take out and shoot. I would much rather have that than an EM2 in 7.62 NATO, because I think that cartridge is just a little too powerful for the design of the EM2. Scale it down a little bit, like 6.5, in terms of felt recoil, and I think you have a much better overall firearm. I would have absolutely no interest in a 5.56 Shosha. That would be like with the Shosha, at least you're getting a full power rifle cartridge out of it. If you've got a gun that's got that many problems with it and it only fires 5.56, no thanks. Nathaniel says, why did pistol designs with the recoil springs below the barrel become more popular than designs with the spring above the barrel, like the Frommer Stop, or I will add, the Browning 1900? With a lower bore axis, wouldn't lower barrel placement reduce felt recoil? So two things. First off, I don't think you're going to get much difference in felt recoil, because it's not really the placement of the barrel that's going to have a big effect on felt recoil. It's how high the center of mass of the slide is, and how bulky is the slide and how fast is it moving. If you want to reduce felt recoil, reduce the mass and velocity, one or both, of the slide. And so moving the spring on top of the barrel doesn't really necessarily change the mass of the slide or its velocity, and that has more impact than exactly where the bullet's coming out. What you also then factor into is if the barrel's on the bottom, then you've got three sides of the barrel already surrounded by stuff. You've got the spring on top, you've got the magazine on the bottom, and then presumably only one side of the slide is actually open. And this gives you a relatively small little ejection port to try and get cases out of. If you put the slide on the bottom, or the spring on the bottom and the barrel on top, you can then have the entire top of the slide open. Look at something like a Beretta, which is a little bit abnormally open, but also virtually all of the other modern pistol designs, where you have an ejection port that can be a lot bigger because it covers two sides of the slide instead of just being a little port on the right-hand side. So that increase in reliability, potential reliability, I think is a lot more important than any slight benefit you would get in felt recoil reduction. Joseph says, why do so many firearms developers use Army trials to fine-tune their firearms, instead of fine-tuning before the trial to work all the kinks out of the design? A good question. We have read many, many stories of people who had potentially a great design, and it went to trials, and some stupid little thing that you'd think would be really easily preventable destroyed its chances. And the reality is, the explanation, I think, is that we always tend to think about these prototype firearms being made in the best possible case. You've got unlimited time and resources to put into this development. And a lot of people would look at it and say, well, you're competing for this potentially hugely lucrative contract. Why wouldn't you spend all of the time plus a little more just to really make sure that the thing that you're producing is going to be the best that it can be and win the trial? And the answer is that the people doing the design generally just don't have that much time and or money to put in. And there are also, of course, always factors that you can never fully account for. You can't predict everything. So a significant military field trial is going to involve hundreds, if not potentially thousands of guns over months of time in a huge variety of situations, of environments. And that's a huge amount of infrastructure for a developer to try and duplicate themselves. Especially because if they can get into the trial, the military is going to pay for all that testing. The military will pay for the test guns, and then the military will cover all the expenses. And it sounds like a fool's bargain to try and bet that the military will handle this for you, but there's often, I don't think, really a choice involved. This sort of thing is always on a deadline. You're always dealing with either a company that has other things it's trying to do, because developing a gun like this does not make money. Developing a gun like this sucks a lot of money out of a company. And so they're always going to be balancing, like, we have to do these things that are actually going to make us money, like Savage and its 32s, compared to, you know, it's got a commercial 32 that it can offer on the market, versus how much work is it going to put into the 45s for Army trials. If you're a startup, how much of that venture capital do you have to blow on, let's say, building 10 guns and putting 10,000 rounds through each of them? That's 100,000 rounds of ammunition. It's 10 handmade guns. People often just don't have the infrastructure to do that. And when we look at this historically, we have to add in communications problems. So you can't just text message someone and be like, oh, hey, such and such looks like it might break, send a new one over to the testing field. No, a lot of this stuff gets done. You send your prototype over, and then months later, you hear back what the results were, and there's not a lot that you can influence in the meantime. Sometimes it's as we would think of as stupid today as, like, the trials gun is made in the wrong caliber because there was misunderstanding about what the requirements were. What was it? There have been a couple of these, but like guns in the .30 carbine trials that, oh, well, they weren't quite in the right cartridge, or pistol trials for the US. Guns that were submitted in .45 caliber, but not the .45 ACP that the US government was specifying. And so those things just get kicked out of the trial right off the bat, regardless of what their qualities might have been otherwise. Next up, Asa says, why wasn't gas-delayed blowback more strongly considered as an operating system? I think the biggest reason is that it is dirty, in a way that gas piston systems are not necessarily, because the point of gas-delayed blowback is that you're filling a volume with gas and retaining it. So you're basically using the gas from a fired cartridge to exert force on the slide for an extended period of time to hold it in place. This is typically a pistol thing, while the bullet travels down the barrel until pressure can drop. With a gas piston system, you're exerting force quickly, and then as soon as the piston gets moving, and there's not, generally speaking, much to stop it, your delay comes from having the gas port located a ways down the barrel so that there's no gas introduced into the piston system until you're pretty close to the bullet leaving the barrel and then pressure decreasing. Well, with the gas delay systems, you're generally gathering gas from right in front of the chamber, so you can hold it for the longest amount of time possible. And what that means is that gas is going to cool during the process of the delaying. The gas is going to expand into a chamber, and then it's going to cool, where a piston is generally not expanding much, and as soon as that piston starts moving, the gas is vented out and allowed to just leave the system. If that gas cools, that's when you start to get more carbon and fouling deposits from it, because the stuff precipitates out, basically. And that's, well, or maybe not precipitates out, but it's able to solidify on the walls of that pressure chamber. And so you end up with guns that have to be cleaned fairly regularly. Now, that may not necessarily be a fundamental problem to the gun, but I think it's always something that people look badly at. If someone's testing that gun for a military purpose, or if they're just looking at it for civilian recreational use, they look at it and go, it's really dirty. Like, you have to clean that every couple hundred rounds. It's a mess. You know what? I'll just get this other version of the gun that isn't that dirty, because it's a Browning tilting barrel system, or if it's a rifle, it's a gas piston system instead of a gas delay system. Next up, Nathan says, in 1912, the Russians made a modernized Mosin prototype that used different materials to make the rifle lighter. One of the things they did was flute the barrel. The Fedorov Automat also had barrel fluting. What's the earliest fluted barrel you have seen? Honestly, I don't know. I can't really think of I know I'm going to get that one wrong, so I'm going to bypass that part of the question. Was this something typically Russian, or did other countries also experiment with barrel fluting, and why do you rarely see it on military rifles? Other people have certainly experimented with barrel fluting, and you typically see it not on rifles but on light machine guns, and that's because it's generally not done so much to reduce barrel weight as it is to increase barrel surface area. The idea being the barrel will cool faster and better if it has more surface area that air can flow across and cool the thing down. Now, if you're making a light machine gun barrel, especially a detachable one, you are balancing weight and cooling ability, or weight and heat retention ability. Like, how long can you fire it before it's too hot to use, and how much does it weigh? Because the less it weighs, the better. You're going to be carrying several of them. But the less often you have to change them, the better it is. So if you can increase the rate at which the barrel cools, then you can reduce the frequency with which you have to change it. And fluting does allow you to reduce weight. However, a fluted barrel is going to, if you're using fluting to reduce weight, you are by definition reducing its mass as well. And the mass of the barrel is a more important element in how long you can fire it than its surface area. You're better off, it's more effective to have more steel in the barrel that can absorb energy before the whole barrel increases in temperature than it is to flute the barrel so that air flowing across it cools it a little bit faster. That's less efficient. In addition, of course, it's expensive to flute barrels. That's a lot of extra machining operations. And I think when it comes to rifles, barrel cooling effectiveness is really kind of zero. Like, you really just don't get anything effective from fluting a rifle barrel in terms of increasing its cooling ability. There is potentially benefit for a light machine gun, and that's why we do see them here and there. When you're talking World War II, actually, a lot of light machine guns had fluted, or sometimes like spiral fluted. Instead of the flutes being longitudinal along the barrel, they'll have what look like rings around the barrel. Because you can cut that on a lathe as a single long operation perhaps more easily than cutting one flute, rotating the barrel, cutting another flute, rotating the barrel, and so on. Dina says, I was wondering, as an aspiring firearms author myself, what unforeseen difficulties did you experience in the process of writing? Secondly, are there any tips you'd give on what to avoid doing while writing to avoid burnout or frustration? So let's see, a couple unforeseen difficulties. I didn't think about original period photographs until a lot later in my writing than I probably should have. I was more focused on the information, the details, the history that I was trying to source out in the book, and I didn't think about the decorative elements. And I really wanted to have period pictures of all the different guns in the book. And I wasn't quite able to get as much as I would have hoped for. So we did basically get pictures of all the guns, but I didn't think about how difficult it would be to find those. The French archive, ECPAD, the French military archives, was rather difficult to work with. I didn't end up actually working with them at all, but they wanted exorbitant fees to license images, and they had a lot of restrictions on them. Things like, I would have, the fee would have been contingent on how many books we printed, and was it going to be for a single printing or 2 printings or 3 printings over the lifetime of the book? And at the time that we were going into this, we had no idea how many copies we were going to sell. So it was, and also, how big are you going to print the picture? That affected what the licensing fee was going to be. And it was just too many variables to be worthwhile. So I ended up getting pictures from a number of private photographers, which was a lot more difficult than it would have been if I had been doing a book on the U.S. military. U.S. National Archives photographs owned by the U.S., owned by the government or the military, are public domain, and you can just use them, which is really nice. So depending on the subject matter, finding period photographs can be difficult. Be aware that, I believe in the US right now, copyright is, there is no copyright on anything before, I believe, 1923 or 1927. I don't remember the exact date now. But anything printed after the 20s or 30s potentially still has a copyright owner, and you can get into huge liability as a publisher if you print copyrighted images without licensing them. That's copyright infringement, and once the book's printed, you're in deep poo if someone potentially comes after you for that. So that's something to be aware of. As in terms of the actual writing process, what I would avoid doing, I think, is trying to write the thing from A to Z, from start to finish in that order. What I did that worked pretty well for me is I laid out the skeleton of the book. What are the chapters? What are the sections within each chapter? And then I would set aside times to write. And I think it's important to formalize that. It doesn't have to be every day, but pick a time when you're actually going to work on the book and sit down and work on the book. But my technique was I'll work on whatever part of the book piques my interest the most at that particular moment. So I might spend a couple weeks working on the MOS 36, and then it's like, okay, you know what? I am bored. Like, I've kind of had my fill of stacking broad variations of the MOS 36 and trying to figure out exactly which ones came when. I'm going to put that aside, and I'm going to go look at the Chassepot. Or, hey, the FRF1. I just read this neat thing about the fight at Loyada, so I'm going to go do some work on the FRF1 chapter. And bouncing around like that allowed me to really keep my interest up in the whole project the whole time. I didn't, even with a subject that you're very interested in, it's easy to get bogged down in the weeds and feel like I'm just not making any progress on this, and it's all stagnating, and it's like, can we be done with this already? Well, feel free to let yourself just stop on a section and move somewhere else and work on some other part of the book that keeps you excited and keeps progress happening. E. Raja says, would you choose the Sturmgewehr 44 or any of the Cold War battle rifles for combat or two-gun? Not what would look cooler, but what would be more effective. And he just got his book. Speaking of books, I hope you enjoy it. The question is a little bit unclear as to, like, would I pick the Sturmgewehr? I'm going to interpret this as, would I pick the Sturmgewehr over the Cold War battle rifles, or which would be my favorite of the Cold War battle rifles, or what would I choose over the Sturmgewehr? The Sturmgewehr is a super cool gun, and I would dearly love to have one, real or good reproduction, although it doesn't look like that's ever happening. There are a couple problems with it, though. One is the magazines tend to be unreliable today, and this is because their springs were questionably made in the first place. A lot of these things were made when Germany was, well, getting the crap bombed out of it on a regular basis, and their manufacturing base was suffering as a result. Because the cartridge is based on 8mm Mauser, it is a very large diameter case, and a 30-round magazine of those things is very long, and it can be a little bit awkward to try and shoot the STG-44 prone, which is something that we do a lot in two-gun. And it's a heavy gun. There's a lot of metal in that thing. I think it handles nicely, but it's heavy. And frankly, given the choice, I would take an AK over a Sturmgewehr for anything where the result mattered, where I really wanted to do well. The AK has a similar sort of cartridge in that it's an intermediate power cartridge. You have 30 rounds of it available instead of more recoil and a 20-round magazine. The AK has the same basic style of sights, but the magazine, the cartridge is smaller and the magazine is curved, meaning that you can get into a nice prone position easily with an AK. The AK weighs a lot less, especially in AKM, and that's valuable. And magazines are far, far more reliable than Sturmgewehr magazines. So I would take an AK over a Sturmgewehr for that. Anthony says, at what point is it a good idea to change a military's weapon system as opposed to improving and upgrading the existing arms? It seems rather fruitless for a military to completely change its main infantry rifle if it's not doing something like switching caliber. Yet we see things like the French moving away from the FAMAS to the HK416. So the rationale for the French doing that change is that they didn't have a manufacturing base to produce more FAMASs. I think what you'll see is militaries are more prone to doing this when they have a batch of guns that are simply getting worn out. And the way the FAMAS adoption worked is they built 400,000 FAMAS rifles over the course of only a handful, like 10 years. They didn't have them in continuous production. So those guns have been in service, both in active combat service and training and reserve use for 40 years now. And it's not really a matter of maintaining them so much as they're just getting to end of life. And if they still had a factory, if Saint-Étienne was still making FAMAS rifles or making other rifles and could switch to the FAMAS, then there would be, I think, a very good reason for them to look into modernizing it and making more of them to, at least keep like the training compatible. But they didn't have that. So they're going to be looking at either building an entirely new arms factory, along with needing all of the design expertise that would go along with it that they lost when Saint-Étienne shut down, along with the other arsenals, or pay a whole lot less money and have a whole lot less risk and just buy them from a foreign supplier, which is what they did. On the other hand, you can see people, you can also see the downside potentially of improving one's existing weapons if we look at the British, which we have another question about here coming up. But you look at what the British have spent turning the L85A1 into an actually serviceable rifle. They would have been far better off to do exactly what the French just did, and they should have just bought M16s from Colt or from Colt Canada or anything from FN. Basically, if they would have had a hard time doing worse overall in the long run than the L85 project. So cost really is the reason. If you're not going to change calibers, it's going to be a matter of cost that justifies switching platforms entirely. The US right now has a lot of generations of M16s and M4s in the inventory, and because they remain in continuous production, it makes sense for the US to continue using the M16 and simply getting new rifles as old ones, as some get so old that they have to be destroyed and gotten rid of because they're too far gone to repair it over and over. Josh says, what is your opinion on breech loading rifles converted to feed from a magazine? Did they work as well as guns built with a magazine? And did they actually save anyone any money? What would have the point been of the Dutch converting all of their Beaumont rifles, even though they were never used in a conflict? Well, when they converted the rifles, they had no idea if they were going to be needing them in a conflict or not. So I don't think that's quite a fair question. As for the rest, generally speaking, magazine conversions didn't really work well. There are a couple exceptions. One of the reasons that they didn't work well or sometimes weren't tried is a lot of these, at this period, you're looking at generally large bore black powder rimmed cartridges. And those just don't work all that well in box magazines. So you have to come up, the ideal magazine system at that point was probably the Kropatschek, the tube magazine under the barrel. And that's a very difficult system to just convert from an existing gun. You end up you can use the barrel and not a whole lot more. The whole stock has to be replaced because you need space for the magazine. You have to add this whole lifter assembly, which means you basically have to replace the receiver. None of the barrel hardware is going to fit because you have to make the stock bigger. Maybe if you've got a two-part stock, maybe you can save the butt stock, but there's just not that much to be gained from converting a single-shot rifle into a two-magazine Kropatschek style one. Now, there are a couple examples that did work out well, and it's basically the Vitali magazine system, which only held 3 cartridges. 3, 4? It was a very small magazine. And it was something that could be done on guns where the bottom of the action was open and available for use. So the Dutch converted their Beaumonts to use Vitali magazines, and the Italians converted their Vetterlis to use Vitali magazines. And the Vitali system was perfectly functional, and it probably did indeed save the Dutch and the Italians a decent bit of money making that conversion instead of buying brand new magazine-fed guns, especially considering that it would not be very long after those guns were made that smokeless powder would be invented, and everyone would all of a sudden be replacing all their guns again. So they didn't know this, again, at the time, but they only needed those magazine conversions for a relatively short period. And so I think it made sense with the Vitali system at least. Now, the other wacky magazine systems that people came up with, things like the Colt Franklin that we looked at not that long ago, those all tended to be pretty kludgy systems with weird stuff hanging off, fragilely hanging off the guns, and just not great. Generally, the conversions just don't work well. When a gun's been designed for a specific function, it's rare that it can be modified after the fact to do something novel and do it well. Let's see, next up is Charles, who says, from my understanding, the Farquhar-Hill rifle, Farquhar-Hill rifle, I think is the correct pronunciation there, was adopted by the British Army shortly before the end of World War I, but never saw service. That is correct. Do you think it would have been effective in service if it had made it to the front lines, and how do you think it would have stacked up against weapons like the BAR and the Shosha? Ooh, that is an interesting and tricky question. The Farquhar-Hill was only a semi-auto rifle, so it wasn't intended to do the job of the Shosha or the BAR, which were both automatic rifles. The British had the Lewis gun, which did a very fine job of being a light machine gun. What they were looking for was a self-loading rifle, more akin to the RSC. And my first reaction upon reading this question was, oh, I've taken apart a Farquhar-Hill. That thing would be a nightmare on a World War I battlefield. But then I have to think, like, I've also taken apart an RSC 1917, and the gas system on those is kind of nightmarish to take apart too. And, well, they did okay. They weren't fantastic. They weren't ideal, but they got the job done, and they were useful. So I suspect that, like many of the novel weapons of World War I, the Farquhar-Hill would have had teething problems at first. Like, look at the first flamethrowers, not that great. Look at the first poison gas use, not that great. Look at the first tanks, not that great. The first airplanes, all this stuff. It took iteration and practice and development to get it working well. And so, could the Farquhar-Hill have led to something that worked reasonably well? Probably. Would it have been something I would have wanted to be the first guy on the front to get? Maybe not. All right, next up we have Aaron, who says, what is your opinion on 7.62 by 54R? Should it still be in service? There should be an easy way to do a rimless conversion. It is absolutely an obsolete cartridge. The rim is not a good thing. The rim makes it difficult to use in a lot of mechanisms. However, I would compare this is going to be a great analogy. I will compare the 7.62 by 54 rimmed to my own typing ability, which is to say the Soviets, the Russians, and then the Soviets kept coming up with designs that worked pretty darn well with the 7.62 by 54R cartridge, and so they kept it in service. There was never an easy point where they could just cut it off and get rid of the thing. So the Maxim gun and the Mosin Nagant, great. The bolt action rifles are pretty much fine with rimmed cartridges. Your Mosin's got a single stack magazine with an interrupter, works fine. And the Maxim with nice widely spaced cloth belts works great. That rim lets you pull the cartridge out of the belt nicely. I think what really led to the cartridge remaining in service was the development of the PK machine gun, which is a fantastic machine gun and is really designed around the 54R cartridge and the belt system that was used by the Maxim. And it was done because that was the cartridge that was in service. We don't want to try and introduce a brand new cartridge here. We want to use what we've got, but get a much more modern gun than the Maxim gun. And so Kalashnikov comes up with this magnificent gun designed around using that big rim to grab the cartridge, pull it out of the belt, and so on. And that gets modernized. It's still in use today. And now here's where the analogy to my typing comes in. I've always known that you've got the proper typing methodology. You put your fingers right in this place, and then each finger has specific certain keys that you type with it. But I've always done kind of the hunt and peck thing, and it was never quite beneficial enough to me to to slow down, because I could hunt and peck a little faster than I could do the formal typing at first. But like every time I had a big paper to write, it's like, well, it'll take me longer if I have to start learning this system. I can do it in like half an hour quicker if I just do the way that I already know. And I did that so long that I got pretty darn good hunting and pecking, and I can type reasonably fast that way today. Well, the Russians are in the same place. They never had a time when it was worth it to go through the logistical issues of abandoning the 54R cartridge, replacing all the ammo in inventory, and trying to introduce something brand new. And they managed to end up with guns that work really pretty darn well with that cartridge. So it will go away eventually, but it's going to be around for a while to come, I think. Modernizing it would be easy. Like, you don't need to modernize it, just pick a different cartridge. There's lots of modern rimless cartridges out there. 7.62 NATO, if nothing else, but there are a lot of other options. You could design your own. Figuring out how to make a rimless cartridge is not the problem. It's the guns that are already in inventory that use the rimmed cartridge and dealing with those. All right, next we have Kyle. It says, in reading your recent book and many others on the subject, it seems like there's always a disconnect between weapon designers, military adoption boards, and the realities of battlefields at the time. Are there any countries or time periods that really stood out in minimizing this disconnect and producing effective, timely weapons? The issue, I think, is largely one of it requires foresight, or really it requires being lucky and guessing what the next weapon will need to be. And to be honest, the best instance I can think of in someone pulling that off is the US with the M1 Garand. That was the right gun at the right time, and it served extremely well for the US military. You could maybe even argue that the M1 Carbine did as well. The M1 Carbine was a concept that not a lot of people were working with, that the US Ordnance Department came up with and pushed, and it ended up being the most produced firearm, most produced rifle of the war by the US, and a very well-liked gun that fit its role very well. So those, to me, really stand out as good examples. I think the Germans came up with some good stuff, but they were kind of chasing battlefield events. The US managed to guess what was going to be pretty good and have it in hand when the war started. The Germans looked at what they were doing, and they were pretty darn good about communicating that back, like the Sturmgewehr really being the obvious example. How do we, like, this is what we need, let's try and real quickly develop a solution for it while we're still in the war. Yeah, that's all I got on that one. Doug says, what is the story with the Mauser DA90? They were made by FEG. Why the Mauser name on them? Well, basically, once you hit after the 1970s, even before the 1970s, Mauser pistol production wasn't really a thing. Mauser reintroduced the Luger, largely, well, for the American market through Interarms, but after World War II, they started to get away from small arms, especially getting away from pistols, and moved slowly towards heavy weaponry, more like large guns, aircraft weapons, artillery style of stuff. And so by the 1970s, 1980s, they didn't really have in-house expertise in small arms design or in pistol design. I really should specify pistol design. They continued to make some interesting and good rifles, but with pistols, the guys who had been involved all kind of left. You see guys like Seidel going to H&K. You know, Seidel designed the HSC for Mauser as a young, innovative engineer, and then he ends up going to HK. And they don't really put any effort into replenishing this. It's not the focus of their business. And so once you get late enough, they're just kind of grasping at straws for any way to stay in the handgun market. And the one asset that they have still is the Mauser name, which is a well-recognized, valuable brand name. And so what they end up doing is basically buying guns from licensing guns from other people, production from other companies like FEG, sticking the Mauser name on a pistol and selling it to try and bring in some money. And didn't work all that well because it didn't last all that long. But that's why you have Hungarian guns with the Mauser name on them. Next up, Loki says, what design or designs were excellent on paper, but the limitations of metallurgy or manufacturing capabilities prevented them from succeeding in their time? Would any of them be successful today? The thing that immediately comes to mind is the 1895 Lee Navy, which was unsuccessful in large part because it was a very small bore, high velocity cartridge for its day. It was 236. It was a 6mm cartridge at, I want to say, 2,500 feet per second. And it caused a lot of throat erosion. The barrel lifespan was pretty darn short because it used pretty hot corrosive powder, and the steels that they had available for the barrel weren't nearly as good as what we have today. Obviously, small bore high velocity cartridges can in fact be made very well today, and we have plenty of things like the 5.56 or the 5.45 or all sorts of other cartridges. Had the Lee Navy been introduced 50 years later, it probably could have been made a whole lot better than it was originally. I'm sure there are other examples, but that's the one that really comes to mind. My first thought was basically every self-loader prior to smokeless powder, but that's not really a matter of metallurgy or machining capability. It's more about chemistry. Liam says, in Half-Life Alyx, Alyx's handgun gets the ability to feed 10 rounds into an internal magazine while being topped off from a traditional 10-round magazine, giving her 20 rounds. Have any weapons ever tried the magazine and hopper design for capacity? The only one I can sort of think of is the Dardic revolver. The answer is no. With the exception of some really weird prototypes that went nowhere because it's a really bad idea. The concept that you would have one magazine that holds half your ammo, and then that's connected to a second magazine that holds the other half of the ammo, is almost automatically going to be a lot less efficient than having one magazine that holds all of it. Because you're coming up with two separate feeding transfer points, and it's not going to work well. The closest thing I can come to for something that was similar were guns that you could feed while they were being fired. So crew-served guns, and the best example is probably the Gatling gun, where the feed stick that you have in the Gatling gun allows you to put in a box of cartridges, drop it in, and continue to put more on top to top the thing up while it's being fired. And there are a number of other guns like that. Someone will probably bring up the Japanese Type 11 light machine gun that has a 30-round hopper that feeds from 5-round stripper clips. So you can theoretically be putting more clips into the hopper while it's feeding from one, but the top cover of the hopper is spring-loaded, and that pressure is important to feed from clip to clip. So it's not like you can leave the thing open and be continuously feeding ammo into it. It's more like you load it up, close it, fire it till it's empty, and then reload it, much like a traditional magazine. A few others, I guess, like the Hotchkiss strip feed guns. You can hook one strip onto another to aid in their continuous feeding, but the system that you're describing here, no one has ever done that in any way successfully. Bunny says, besides interesting shell casings, what might you suggest someone with an interest in forgotten weapons but not much money could collect? Well, in any collecting field, anything at all, you will always have a situation where the rare and desirable stuff is expensive. And it's always like parabolic. You can spend an insane amount of money on the most collectible of the most inane things. So that said, there are certainly areas of collecting that are cheaper than whole firearms. Also areas of collecting that are easier than firearms, depending on the legislation where you live. The one that comes to my mind is magazines. I think detachable magazines are a really interesting side field of firearms technology and collecting. And so I have a handful of magazines, maybe more than a handful, for guns that I don't own, because I think the magazines themselves are really interesting and cool. And they can often show technological solutions to various different problems. So what different features do you have in magazines that are designed around rimmed cartridges versus rimless? Different spring designs. There are some constant force springs that are used instead of traditional coil springs. And then you've got some really weird, cool stuff. I was lucky enough to find a Project Spew magazine that actually holds 2 stacks of cartridges, one in front and one in back. And it's a 60-round magazine that's about 6 inches long front to back. So I think a magazine collection would be a pretty neat thing. And most of that stuff is relatively inexpensive, certainly a lot cheaper than the guns that they go into. Clips as a similar thing, not just magazines, but also clips. I know 1 or 2 people out there who collect firearms tools, like the repair tools, the accessory kits that were issued with guns, especially machine guns. That stuff is out there, and that's an interesting collectible that a lot of people don't put a very high dollar value on. You could do slings. That's really pretty boring, I think, but you could. Cleaning rods. I guess actually the other obvious one would be bayonets. They are self-contained items that a lot of people find pretty cool and interesting. There's a lot of variation to them, especially over time. They're not regulated like firearms, obviously, and they don't cost nearly as much as firearms until, again, you get to the really high end when, oh yeah, you can spend $1,000 on a bayonet. Easy. All right, Matt says, if, rather than choosing the Krag Jorgensen, the U.S. Army had decided to adopt the most successful Mauser prototype from the 1892 rifle trials in the 30 cal rimless cartridge that was tested, or just in 7.65 Mauser like one of the other submissions, what would U.S. small arms development have looked like for the late 19th and early 20th centuries? Would we still get the infighting over the rear sight style that lasted all the way until 1905? Would the U.S. also upgrade to a 98 pattern like so many other countries that had previously adopted older smokeless Mauser variants? Would it be a universal short rifle? Would the shorter cartridge make U.S. adoption of the Shosha and the Lewis gun easier than World War I? Easier during World War I? I think in general, not much would have changed. I think basically, if we had adopted a 1892-93 pattern Mauser, we never would have had the replacement by the Springfield, the 03 Springfield, because we basically already had that. It is an interesting question when and where the U.S. would have gone from the long rifle for the infantry, short rifle for the cavalry, to like universal short rifle for everybody. I don't know if that would have happened or not. I suspect the rear sight issue wouldn't have been so much of a thing because they probably would have ended up with, I suspect they would have ended up with a 1903 style sight on the Mauser, or just gone with a notch sight and accepted it. There is a possibility there, but then we're getting into like what personalities would have come out on top and what, I can't predict that. Had we gone with a shorter cartridge length, it definitely would have made things easier in World War I had we wanted to adopt foreign small arms. Not having to stretch the action of a gun to fit the US cartridge, that would have been a big advantage. But either way, that Mauser would have been overtaken by the M1 Garand. I see, to me, if we'd adopted a Mauser instead of the Krag, you would basically take the Krag and the Springfield and just squish them together. They would have been a single rifle. And the only real development question to me is if and when they went to a short rifle instead of a rifle and a carbine. Joshua says, during the search for a replacement for the Thompson in World War II, was the M1 carbine in full auto, aka the M2, ever considered as a possible replacement? Either way, do you feel it would have been a good idea to implement it in that role, both in terms of production and combat effectiveness? And he goes on to mention that, in fact, a full auto capability was part of the original M1 carbine requirements, the trials guns. So first off, the reason that the M1 carbine, they ditched the full auto requirement was because what they found in the early round of testing was that you didn't get effective full auto accuracy. And for the intended role at that point, if you couldn't get the accuracy, people were spending a lot of weight allowance on having full auto capable trigger groups with extra parts and capability. And it made sense to get rid of that because the weight limit was really pretty strict on the M1 carbine and people were having a hard time meeting it. So they look at that and they look at, you're taking this 5-pound rifle, firing full auto, a cartridge that's more powerful than the pistol cartridge. Yeah, it's not really going to be effectively controllable at long range. Now, by the time we get to 1944-45, they've kind of changed their minds on that, and there's a high demand from the field for a full auto capable version of the M1 carbine. Now, was that considered as a replacement for the Thompson? No, because the full auto M1 carbine, the M2 carbine, didn't exist at the time that they were looking for a Thompson replacement. However, the M1 carbine did replace the submachine gun in a lot of areas of the TO&E, Table of Organization and Equipment. There's some interesting documentation from the Marine Corps talking about a Marine Corps desire among some elements of the Corps to completely replace the pistol and the submachine gun with the M1 carbine because they found it to actually be more effective. In the jungle, they found that the velocity of the M1 carbine projectile made it better at penetrating brush, jungle undergrowth, than the .45 caliber pistol or submachine gun ammo. As well as, I'm sure, it's higher capacity than the pistol. So it did effectively replace the submachine gun in a lot of places. It wasn't a gun where they replaced a Thompson, take away the guy's Thompson and give him a grease gun. Instead, it was more a matter of this combat role or non-combat role no longer gets a submachine gun, now they get a carbine instead. So, do I think it's a good idea? Yeah, I think I do. I would, boy, that'd be a really interesting one to test. Combat effectiveness of a submachine gun versus an M1 carbine, especially when you consider that a Thompson gun weighs like 2.5 times as much as an M1 carbine. There's a really interesting thing to be had there. Now, I will have to look into trying to figure out a way to do some hands-on testing with that. All right, we have 3 more here. Timo says, why did the Japanese go to a semi-rimmed cartridge with their 6.5 by 50 millimeter ammunition? Why not straight to rimless? And the answer is that semi-rimless, which is semi-rimless cartridges, existed only for a fairly brief time. There aren't many of them out there. The most common ones today are 25 and 32 ACP. There's also the 9mm Browning, 9x20, which is a semi-rimmed cartridge. And the reason was, when those were developed, it was very early in metallic cartridge production, and the semi-rim allowed you to headspace the cartridge off of the rim, which was a lot easier to dimension exactly. The alternative, what we do today, is on a straight-walled case, we headspace off the front of the case, the mouth, and on a shouldered case, like most military rifle cartridges, we headspace off the shoulder. And at the time that these cartridges were developed, like the 6.5 Japanese, it was seen as advantageous to not have to have the cartridges precisely made to headspace off the shoulder. Like, it was difficult to mass produce cartridges with a good enough tolerance on the shoulder to do that. Instead, it was a lot easier to headspace off the rim. So by using a semi-rim design, basically what you've got is a rim that's just barely bigger than the cartridge body. Just enough that you can use it to stick the thing into the chamber and have it stop on the rim. They still cut an extractor groove, unlike a rimmed cartridge. So the idea was the rim wasn't prominent enough to really cause any issues in a box magazine. And so it kind of seemed like the best of both worlds. You get the easy magazine stacking of a rimless case, but you also get the easy head spacing of a rimmed case. However, it would only be a relatively short time before the production technology evolved to the point that head spacing off the shoulder was really no big deal. And at that point, then it's beneficial to not have any rim at all. So that's why the Japanese went with that. Mark says, HK have now mostly solved the flaws with the SA-80 weapon system, and the L85A2 and A3 are adequate rifles. Good choice of words. They are indeed adequate rifles. Given how much money it took to develop the rifles to this point, do you think the British military would have been better off if they had just tossed the entire project out and put the EM2 into production in 280? No. And I think Jonathan Ferguson's book on British bullpups will bring more light to this, but the SA-80 was never really fully developed. It lost the trials, and it was basically taken out of competition before it went through enough development to really be field ready. Had you taken the EM2 and given it to the engineers who did the SA-80, the problem with SA-80 was the engineers didn't have the expertise and the experience at small arms development to do it, and they were saddled by serious cost limitations, restrictions. Give them the EM2, the lack of expertise is going to be a problem. They're probably going to have a difficult time finalizing and cleaning up the design to make it ready for mass production. And the EM2 is an even more expensive weapon to produce than the Enfield weapon system that was the progenitor of the L85. So I think actually it really would have made the problems worse, believe it or not. What the British should have done, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is just buy M16s from anybody. And our last question for today, which is good because my voice is starting to go, is from Jubs, who says, have there been any constant recoil pistols, i.e. pistols where the slide doesn't impact the frame at end of travel, instead being slowed down by the springs? It's of course not as important as it is on a machine gun, but I think it would still reduce the sharpness of the perceived recoil. It would. I am not aware of any pistols that were designed to do that, although to be fair, that's not a question that that's not a feature that a lot of people look at specifically. So I would feel more secure saying that there aren't any if I had done more high-speed video of more pistol designs to look at what the slide velocity is when it actually hits the end of travel. But as a general rule, the problem is constant recoil requires a relatively longer receiver than not constant recoil. And being compact is a major consideration for pistols. Even if it's a big service pistol, you don't want it any bigger than it really has to be. And making the gun longer is going to have a greater impact on it than making a rifle a little bit longer. So yes, I think if you could stop the slide from having any firm impact on the end of travel, that would definitely improve felt recoil, reduce felt recoil. But I don't know of anybody who's sacrificed enough stuff to make it happen. As I say a lot, I think, all elements of firearms design are compromises, and you're going to compromise a lot to end up with a slide that does that. And in the end, it's probably not worth the benefit. So that is a whole bunch of questions for Q&A number 41 today. A tremendous thank you to everyone on Patreon who makes Forgotten Weapons possible. These questions all came from patrons, so if you are not signed up to help support the channel on Patreon, I encourage you to take a look and do so. What I do is when I'm getting ready to do a Q&A, I put out a request for questions and take them and then curate them down, because I get way more questions than I can answer on any given time. We do 20 or 25 each Q&A, and I get a couple hundred submissions. So if you submitted your question and I didn't pick it, go ahead and submit it again, and I'll do my best to get to it on a second run through. Thank you all for watching.